1. Introduction to the journey. In the quiet moments between everyday routines, there comes a stirring, a feeling that there is more to life than what is immediately visible, more to the world than the predictable paths we walk daily. This is the beginning of a personal journey, not one that leads to distant lands or grand adventures, but into the very heart of understanding, self-discovery, and purpose. The journey ahead is one of introspection, where each step is a deeper dive into the core of who we are and what we truly seek from life. The protagonist of this journey is anyone who has ever felt the weight of questions unanswered, the yearning for something beyond the mundane. It is about the exploration of a life's meaning, the pursuit of a deeper understanding of the world and oneself. Challenges are inevitable, not only from external forces, but from within. There are doubts, hesitations, and the creeping fear of failure that make each step seem uncertain. And yet, with each challenge comes the potential for discovery. Every misstep, every moment of confusion, serves to guide the way forward, teaching lessons that could not be learned without encountering obstacles along the way. The lessons to be discovered will not come easy, but they will shape the path, forging a way toward insight and wisdom. This journey may not offer easy answers, but it promises transformation. It is a quest not for a destination, but for understanding, one that will change the protagonist forever. The challenge ahead is not simply a matter of crossing a physical or metaphorical finish line, but of encountering something more profound, something life-changing, the discovery of a greater truth that resides both within and beyond. 2. The call to action. It began with a question, a simple query, like the whisper of a thought that lingers in the back of the mind, but one that demanded an answer. What if there is more to life than what I'm living now? This question, trivial at first, began to gnaw at the protagonist's consciousness, growing louder and more insistent. They had long been living what could be considered a comfortable life, a steady job, familiar routines, and a sense of security that on the surface seemed to be everything one could ask for. Yet beneath it all, there was a persistent feeling of emptiness, a feeling that they had settled for a version of life that lacked depth. The conflict was immediate and internal. On one hand, there was the comfort of the familiar, the life they had built, a life that promised stability and a sense of control. On the other hand, there was the call of something unknown, something that tugged at the heart and whispered that there was more to be discovered. The protagonist was torn, unsure whether to embrace the security they knew or to step into the uncertainty that beckoned like a shadow on the horizon. Each day, the question lingered, gnawing away at the sense of peace they once felt. Would taking a risk lead to growth? Or would it only serve to dismantle everything they had worked so hard to build? The fear of failure, of disappointment, and of the unknown weighed heavily on their shoulders. Yet despite the fear, there was a quiet voice urging them forward, urging them to take a leap of faith. The critical decision was approaching. Would they stay, comfortable but stagnating? Or would they embrace the unknown and seek a greater understanding? This was the turning point, the moment when the protagonist would have to make a choice that would set the course for the rest of their journey. The path ahead could lead to fulfillment or to failure, but either way, it was clear that the time had come to decide. The journey was no longer a distant dream, but an urgent call that demanded action. The decision, though difficult, was now inevitable. 3. The road to understanding. With the decision made, the protagonist took the first steps into the unknown. There was no ground roadmap, no clear direction, only an inner conviction that the journey had to be undertaken. It wasn't easy. The world outside seemed unchanged, still full of the same distractions and demands. But now, the protagonist saw it through a different lens. The questions that had haunted them for so long suddenly felt more pressing. Each day became a search for answers that they could no longer ignore. The first key step was simple, though not without its challenges, to step away from the life they had known. The protagonists quit their job, packed away old comforts, and began exploring new territories. Physically, emotionally, and intellectually. They travelled to new places, read books they had never considered, and began surrounding themselves with people whose views and experiences were vastly different from their own. It was in these first moments of change that they found the beauty of stepping outside their comfort zone. New perspectives emerged, and for the first time in a long time, the protagonist felt alive with possibility. But as the journey unfolded, so did the challenges. Doubts crept in, and with them, fear. The money from their savings began to dwindle, and the stress of not knowing what would come next started to weigh heavily on their shoulders. The initial spark of excitement began to dim as uncertainty filled the void. Would this search for meaning lead to something fulfilling, or would it turn into a pointless wandering? The fear of failure lingered in the back of their mind, whispering that perhaps they had made a mistake in abandoning the life they knew. Yet even amidst these doubts, there were signs of hope. They met people who shared their own struggles and aspirations, and in those conversations, the protagonist felt glimpses of the profound answers they sought. There were moments of quiet realization where new thoughts surfaced like fresh water bubbling to the surface. It wasn't the clarity they had expected, but it was something deeper, a sense that they were moving in the right direction, even if the path ahead was still clouded with uncertainty. The journey wasn't a straight line, but rather a winding road filled with both confusion and revelation. At times, the protagonist could almost taste the truth, but it remained elusive, like an uncatchable star. The frustration mounted, but so did the understanding that every step, even the setbacks, was part of something greater. It wasn't just about finding answers. It was about learning how to ask the right questions and how to embrace the mystery of the journey itself. 4. The turning point. One evening, deep into the journey, the protagonists found themselves in a small village by the edge of a vast, empty desert. They had been travelling for weeks, moving from place to place, seeking answers, but feeling as though they were getting nowhere. The landscape was stark and silent, mirroring the uncertainty they felt within. Here, in the quiet solitude of the desert, they met an elderly woman, a figure who seemed both familiar and otherworldly. The woman's eyes were sharp but kind, and she greeted the protagonist with a question that seemed to pierce the very core of their being. "What is it you are truly searching for?" she asked, her voice soft but commanding. It was a simple question, one that had been asked by many people, but now, in this place, it felt as if the weight of the world was behind it. For the first time, the protagonists found themselves speechless. The truth of their quest had eluded them, but now they realized that they had never truly understood what they were searching for. The conversation that followed was not one of grand wisdom or life-altering revelations. Rather, it was a quiet exchange, a simple reflection on the journey itself. The elderly woman spoke of the desert, how it appeared barren on the surface, yet beneath it there was life, unseen and waiting to be discovered. She spoke of patience, of allowing time to uncover the layers hidden beneath the surface of things. "You're so focused on the destination," she said gently, "that you forget to notice the path itself. Sometimes the answer lies not in the finding, but in the seeking." This moment changed everything. What had seemed like a search for meaning or understanding suddenly felt like a deeper question of how to approach life itself. The turning point was not an external event, but an internal shift. A realization that the journey was not about solving a puzzle, but about embracing the mystery. The simplicity of the question, "What is it you are truly searching for?" haunted the protagonist, but in a way that brought clarity. What had once seemed like a straight path to a grand discovery now appeared infinitely more complicated. Their answers, they realized, were not simply waiting at the end of the road. Instead, the journey itself was the answer. A journey that involved embracing uncertainty, learning to live with questions, and finding peace in the ambiguity of existence. The fear and doubts that had once clouded their mind began to fade, replaced by an overwhelming sense of awe at the complexity and beauty of life. In that moment, the protagonist understood that they had not been lost after all. They had been learning to walk a different kind of path, one that would not lead to clear answers, but to a richer, fuller experience of life. The journey was not over. It had only just begun. 5. The struggle. After the turning point, the protagonist felt a glimmer of peace, a brief sense that the questions they had sought answers to for so long might finally be answered in the journey itself. But that peace was fleeting. As the days passed, they found themselves once again grappling with the weight of uncertainty. The internal conflict that had driven them to leave behind the security of their old life now intensified. What had once seemed like a new beginning now appeared like an endless labyrinth, each turn leading to more questions, more doubts, and an overwhelming sense of isolation. The lessons learned from the elderly woman in the desert seemed distant now, like whispers in the wind that couldn't be fully grasped. The protagonist tried to take her advice to heart, but with each passing day, the reality of the world around them grew heavier. They were not just travelling physically, they were travelling through their own mind, confronting parts of themselves that had long been hidden away. Fear, doubt, and regret began to resurface in ways they hadn't anticipated. The hardest moments came when they were forced to confront the consequences of their decisions. Money had run out. The freedom they had once savoured now felt like an empty cage. They had no safety net, no fallback plan. And yet, the idea of returning to their old life, to the comfort they had once known, felt like giving up, an admission of failure. The protagonist was stuck between the longing to find deeper meaning and the practical realities of life that demanded action. The battle between these two forces was relentless. During this time, the protagonist met others who seemed to be on their own journeys, people who were also searching for something more, but whose paths were far more uncertain. One man, an artist named Elias, had left behind his career in finance to pursue a life of creativity. However, Elias was struggling. He had not found the success he had hoped for, and his desperation was clear. He often told the protagonist that he didn't know if he had made the right choice, if his journey was worth the sacrifice. His doubts were contagious, and they began to seep into the protagonist's thoughts. Was the search for meaning a noble pursuit, Or was it just a form of escapism? At the same time, a woman named Ava, who seemed to have all the answers, came into the protagonist's life. Ava was confident, pragmatic, and entirely focused on her career. She had found success in a field the protagonist once considered, but her life felt devoid of the passion and fulfillment that had driven the protagonist to begin their journey. Ava told the protagonist to stop chasing abstract ideals and embrace what was practical, what worked. The world isn't a playground for self-discovery, she warned. You can't live in the clouds forever. Her words made the protagonist feel torn, like they were on the edge of a precipice, unsure which side to choose. Was their journey of meaning truly worth the risk, or was it time to return to solid ground? Each new encounter, each new piece of advice, caused the protagonist to spiral further into confusion. They questioned their motives, their purpose, and the authenticity of their journey. What had once felt like a personal quest now seemed to be a dangerous game of chance, with no clear way forward. The struggle wasn't just external, it was internal, as the protagonists wrestled with their own fears and the growing realization that they might never find the answers they were looking for. As the days wore on, the protagonist's doubt intensified, and the path ahead seemed more and more impossible to navigate. What they had thought was a path of liberation was starting to feel like a downward spiral into uncertainty. The very thing they had been searching for, meaning, felt increasingly out of reach, and the more they searched, the more they seemed to lose. 6. New insights. One evening, after weeks of wandering aimlessly and feeling on the verge of giving up, the protagonists found themselves sitting alone under a sky filled with stars, just outside a small town they had stumbled upon. They had no destination in mind, no plan for what came next. It felt as though the world had become a vast, indifferent ocean, and they were simply adrift. That's when the breakthrough came, unbidden, like a sudden realization that arrived in a flash. The protagonist remembered the words of the elderly woman in the desert. The answer lies not in the finding, but in the seeking. They had been searching so intensely for answers that they had failed to appreciate the act of seeking itself, the process, the questions, the journey as it unfolded. It was not about the end result, but about living fully in the search. It was a revelation, a moment of clarity that shifted everything they had thought they knew. For the first time in months, the protagonist felt a sense of deep peace. They no longer needed to know the answers to everything, nor did they need to find some grand revelation to justify their journey. The act of questioning itself, of being open to the unknown, was the essence of what they were truly seeking. They realized that life was not a puzzle to be solved, but a story to be lived. The doubts, the fears, the struggles, and the triumphs, all of these were part of the experience, each one leading to a richer understanding of the world and of themselves. Emotionally, the protagonist felt a rush of relief, a lifting of the weight that had burdened them for so long. The relentless pressure to find a definitive answer had been replaced by a quiet acceptance of the unknown. The questions no longer felt like threats. They were simply the means by which they could grow. However, even as they embraced this newfound clarity, the consequences of their journey began to unfold. They had abandoned their old life, and there was no going back. The relationships they had once relied on had become distant, strained by their absence. Their financial resources were nearly exhausted, and the practical challenges of life were still looming large. But in the midst of these difficulties, the protagonist realized that the journey had never been about escaping these challenges. It had been about learning how to face them with a different perspective. The path forward was still uncertain, but they now had the tools to navigate it with a sense of purpose and understanding. The journey was far from over, and there was still much to discover, but the protagonists felt as though they had crossed a threshold. The journey was no longer a frantic search for meaning. It was a deliberate exploration of life itself, filled with questions, yes, but also with the promise of growth. The story was unfolding, and the protagonist was no longer afraid to live it. 7. The final challenge. As the protagonists moved further down their path, they felt an unsettling shift in the air, a heaviness that grew as they approached the edge of the unknown. The journey had been long, filled with moments of clarity and insight, but the resolution they sought seemed perpetually out of reach. Every step, though marked by growth, had only revealed more questions, more complexities. They had learned to embrace the mystery, yet it was becoming clear that there was one final challenge, one that would test every lesson they had learned and every ounce of resolve they had left. It came in the form of an invitation, one that seemed innocent at first, to return to the city they had once known, to the life they had left behind. The world they had fled was calling them back, loudly and with undeniable force. The people who had known them before were waiting, expecting them to return to the role they had once played. They had friends, family, and colleagues who had watched the protagonist's journey from the outside, each with their own opinions on what it should have meant. Some were proud, some were skeptical, and some simply wanted the protagonist to come home, to stop wandering. They had heard of the struggles and hardships the protagonist had faced, but they saw none of the transformation, the growth, the understanding. Only a person who had left everything behind in search of something they couldn't even define. The protagonist had the option to return to the life they had left behind, to settle into the familiar routine that once felt so confining. The decision was agonizing. On one hand, there was the promise of comfort, of a life that might be predictable and stable. It was an easy escape, a return to something they had once known. But on the other hand, returning meant abandoning everything they had learned on their journey. It meant turning their back on the very transformation they had fought so hard for. It meant conceding that the search for meaning had been a mistake, that the questions were futile, that they could never escape the confines of the life they had been born into. The stakes had never been higher. The journey had already cost the protagonist so much: time, relationships, money, and more. But this final challenge was not just about the loss of external things. This was a challenge that would determine who they were at their core. Would they choose to return to the familiar, or would they continue the journey into the unknown, even if it meant walking alone and uncertain forever? The decision loomed over them like a storm cloud, casting shadows over everything they had worked for. Could they really keep going, knowing there was no clear end in sight? As the days passed, the protagonist's doubts grew. They tried to imagine returning to their old life and what it might feel like. Could they fit back into the person they once were? Would their past self even recognize them now, after everything they had been through? The thought of returning seemed both comforting and suffocating. Yet staying on the path they had chosen felt more uncertain with each passing day. The further they wandered, the more it seemed like they were chasing a phantom, always just out of reach. The greatest obstacle lay not in the external world, but within the protagonists themselves. They began to question the authenticity of their journey. Had they been a flight from responsibility? Had they been fooling themselves into thinking they were searching for something deeper, when in fact they were simply running away? The profound realizations, the new insights, the moments of clarity, were they real, or were they simply the product of a mind desperate for meaning? The fear of failure, of having wasted everything, gripped them like a vice, making each step forward feel heavier than the last. The stakes grew higher still when they learned that Elias, the artist who had once seemed so sure of his own pursuit of passion, had succumbed to despair. Elias had returned to the city, back to his old life, convinced that the journey for meaning was a fool's errand. His return was a sign to the protagonist, wasn't it? Maybe Elias had been right all along. Was the journey worth it if it led only to an endless spiral of doubt and uncertainty? Could they avoid the same fate? Ava, too, reappeared at a pivotal moment. She had been watching from the sidelines, and now she stood before the protagonist, offering one last piece of advice. It's time to stop pretending that you can keep walking a path without a destination. If you're searching for something that doesn't exist, you'll only wind up lost. Let it go. Move on. Her voice was firm, her logic hard to refute. The protagonist's heart wavered, torn between the call of a life that seemed so certain and the raw, unknown path they had already begun to tread. In the face of these mounting pressures, the protagonist was left with one final question. Could they push forward, knowing that the resolution they sought might never come? Could they find peace in continuing, even if the journey was futile, even if the answers they sought never appeared? The weight of this decision crushed them. The final challenge was not an external obstacle or a physical barrier. It was an internal battle, a war against doubt, fear, and the overwhelming temptation to give up. The question wasn't just whether they could continue, but whether they should continue, or if the cost was simply too great. It was a battle that seemed insurmountable, a challenge that threatened to break them. Success, at least the success they had imagined, seemed unattainable. The end of the journey, if it even existed, seemed forever out of reach. And yet, somewhere deep within, the protagonist knew that their path could only be completed by facing this final test. 8. Climax and resolution. The night before the final decision loomed, the protagonist stood at the edge of a vast, silent lake. The water reflected the moonlight, casting an eerie glow on the surface, as if the universe itself were waiting for the protagonist to choose. The tension of the past few weeks had built to this moment, and as they stared into the stillness, it felt as though the world had paused, holding its breath. The familiar voices of Elias and Ava echoed in the protagonist's mind, their opinions swirling like ghosts, one telling them to give up the search, to return to what was known, while the other challenged them to keep moving forward no matter the cost. The fear that had held them captive for so long surged again, more powerful than ever. What if they were wrong? What if the journey was just an endless cycle of questions with no real answers? What if they were just fooling themselves? The very thought of returning, of abandoning everything they had fought for, felt like a betrayal, not just to their journey, but to themselves. But as the wind rustled through the trees around them, something shifted. The stillness of the lake seemed to call out, beckoning the protagonist to see the truth. For the first time, the protagonist realized that they weren't simply walking through an endless maze. They weren't lost. The journey itself with all its doubts and fears, had already taught them the most profound lesson. The path wasn't about finding a definitive answer or returning to an old life. It was about living with uncertainty, embracing the questions, and accepting that the search was the very essence of the journey. With that realization, the protagonist felt an overwhelming surge of clarity, and for the first time, the heavy weight of fear seemed to lift. They weren't running away from something, nor were they returning to something. They were simply walking, choosing to embrace the uncertainty of life, knowing that answers would come, not in the form of clear-cut solutions, but through each experience, each moment of introspection, each person met along the way. And then, the decision had to be made. As the morning sun began to rise, casting a golden light over the lake, the protagonist stood up. The water stretched before them, vast and deep, symbolizing the unknown ahead. In that moment, they understood that it wasn't about whether they succeeded in finding answers. It was about finding peace in the search itself. They realized that the next step, whatever it was, would be a continuation of the journey, and that was enough. The pressure of needing a definitive resolution dissolved into something simpler, an acceptance that life itself is the answer. With a deep breath, the protagonists made their choice. They would not return to the life they had left behind, nor would they walk away from the journey. They would move forward, with no clear idea of what lay ahead, but with the understanding that every step, even the uncertain ones, was part of the discovery. In that moment, they took their first step toward the unknown, not out of desperation, but with a quiet confidence born from self-discovery. It was as though the very earth beneath them had shifted, supporting them in a way it never had before. The protagonist didn't need to know what would come next. The answers might still be elusive, but the meaning of their journey had already been found. But even as they moved forward, the protagonist couldn't shake the lingering sense that there was more to understand, more to learn. They had faced their greatest fear, the fear of failure, the fear of meaninglessness, and had come through it. But there were still questions, still mysteries to uncover. The world was vast, and the journey was far from over. And as the protagonist walked on, they knew that every new step would bring new challenges and discoveries. They might never have all the answers, but they were finally at peace with the questions. For the first time, the protagonist didn't feel the weight of the unknown as a burden. Instead, it felt like an invitation to keep walking, to keep seeking, and to keep embracing the journey for what it was. The story was still unfolding, and though the future remained uncertain, the protagonist had found the courage to keep moving forward into the mystery. There was no clear resolution, but there didn't need to be. The journey itself had become the resolution. 9. The aftermath. In the days that followed the protagonist's decision to move forward, life began to take on a new shape. The path ahead was still unknown, but the fear that had once clouded every step was now replaced by a sense of quiet resolve. Each morning, the protagonist woke with a sense of anticipation, not for a specific destination, but for the unfolding of the day. The uncertainty, once a source of anxiety, had become a canvas upon which they could paint new experiences. Their external world had shifted too. They no longer felt tethered to the past, to the version of themselves that had once been defined by the expectations of others or the demands of a predictable life. Their relationships, once strained by distance, began to evolve as well. Some people in their life like Ava, continued to encourage them to return to stability, while others, like Elias, acknowledged that the journey was theirs alone. What had seemed like a source of isolation, the distance between the protagonist and those they had once known, now felt like the space needed for growth. The connections they formed, moving forward, felt more authentic, built on shared experiences rather than the pressure of fitting into predefined roles. The protagonist had also begun to rediscover old passions, writing, painting, and even moments of introspection in nature that had been buried beneath the weight of societal expectations. What had once seemed like a pursuit of meaning now felt more like a deep reconnection with the self, a celebration of personal expression rather than an attempt to solve life's ultimate questions. There was a subtle shift in how the protagonist approached the world, now seeing it as a place of possibility rather than a set of challenges to be conquered. Yet as they walked forward, there was a quiet understanding that the journey was far from complete. The insights they had gained felt like pieces of a much larger puzzle, and while they had found peace in their search, there was still more to learn. The questions hadn't disappeared. They had simply taken on a different tone, one less urgent and more reflective. The protagonist knew there would be more obstacles, more internal struggles, and more external choices to be made, but they were no longer afraid of the unknown. They had become comfortable with the mystery. 10th conclusion and reflection. In the end, the protagonist had learned that the search for meaning is not about finding one clear answer, but about embracing the journey itself. What began as a quest for understanding had transformed into a deeper appreciation for the act of seeking, for the richness found in every step of the way. The initial question, what is the meaning of it all, had not been fully answered, nor had it needed to be. The question itself had evolved, transforming from a burden into a lifelong exploration. The protagonist now understood that meaning wasn't a destination, it was a process, woven into the fabric of everyday life. They had learned to embrace uncertainty, to live with the questions rather than waiting for answers. In the end, the journey wasn't about escaping their old life, but about integrating the lessons learned along the way into a fuller, more authentic existence. And yet, as the protagonist moved into the future, there was an undeniable sense that the story was far from over. There would always be more to learn, more to discover, more challenges to face. The call to continue seeking would never fade. It was a part of who they had become. As the protagonist walked forward, the horizon remained just out of reach, but this time it didn't matter. The journey, with all its twists and turns, was exactly where they needed to be. What lies ahead is unknown, but that is exactly how it should be. The journey continues, and in it, their answers will unfold.